Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be looking at state finances in the U.S.
Okay.
And it's a little bit of a head-scratcher, right? We just came out of like a boom,
Right.
big economic boom. We had all this federal aid flowing, and yet so many states seem to be struggling financially.
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. A lot of people think that, states are doing well, but there's a lot more going on beneath the surface.
So let's rewind a little bit back to the pandemic when it seemed like the world was turning upside down financially. We saw empty streets, but state coffers were overflowing.
Yeah, it was kind of strange time, right? You had all this federal aid that came in, coupled with, a unique economic boom that was fueled by a lot of changes in spending habits.
Right.
And that led to a surge in state revenue. So at the surface level, it looked like things were great.
So it was kind of like a sugar high. Everything seemed fine, but there was a crash coming.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And I think the problem is that some states treated this temporary windfall as if it was the new normal.
Right.
And made some decisions that, in retrospect, maybe weren't the best. I'm thinking about one state in particular that enacted the largest tax cut in its history at the same time that it implemented the largest teacher salary increase.
It's like a little bit of a contradiction, right? Cutting revenue and increasing spending.
Exactly. And, these moves really masked some fundamental weaknesses that were in a lot of state budgets. And the thing is that federal aid is set to expire in 2026.
Oh, so that safety net's going away. What happens then?
Well, that leads us to one of the biggest ticking time bombs in state finances, which are pensions.
Pensions always seemed a little mysterious to me. Can we just break it down, like what exactly are they and why are they such a big issue?
Yeah, so a pension, you can think of it as kind of like a guaranteed retirement income.
Right.
And imagine that 86% of public employees, teachers, police officers, firefighters all receive this benefit.
86%? I had no idea it was that high.
Yeah. It's a huge number. And, it creates this massive long-term financial obligation for states to shoulder.
No wonder they're putting such a strain on budgets.
Yeah, and I think the problem's even bigger than a lot of people realize, because when you fully account for these future pension obligations, 27 states don't have enough money to cover their bills right now.
So they're in the red?
Yeah, essentially.
Is there like a real-world example of just how bad it is?
Yeah, look at Illinois. They're billions of dollars in the hole to their former employees.
Wow.
And they owe them significantly more than they have available to pay.
That sounds dire. What are they doing to try to fix it?
Well, J.P. Morgan, the financial giant, came out and suggested that they double the state income tax overnight.
Ouch. I'm sure that went over well with people. Doubling their income tax, it seems like a last resort, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Is there any other way out of this mess?
It's incredibly difficult, and I think it illustrates just how much this debt impacts everything else. States are forced to choose between paying retirees what they're owed and funding essential services like schools and hospitals and roads.
Right.
It's a tough situation with no easy answers.
So we've got dwindling federal aid, massive pension liabilities. It's a pretty gloomy picture so far. What else is adding to this financial strain?
Well, let's talk about something that on the surface might seem like a good thing: tax cuts.
Tax cuts. I thought those were supposed to stimulate the economy, attract businesses and residents.
They can, but it's a bit of a gamble. Lower taxes means less revenue for states.
Right.
Which could potentially make those budget issues even worse.
Yeah.
It's kind of like trying to fill a leaky bucket by making the hole bigger.
Yeah, I see the problem there. Is there a real world example of this backfiring?
Yeah. California offers a really interesting case study. They found that a 3% increase in the marginal tax rate for top earners led to a 0.8% loss in the tax base.
So it's not a huge change.
No.
But it all adds up.
It does, and it highlights this delicate balance that states have to maintain between attracting investment and ensuring they have enough revenue to function.
Right.
Tax cuts might sound appealing, but they can have these unintended consequences.
Yeah. So you have these pre-existing vulnerabilities. And then on top of it all, we have this major threat that's often ignored in discussions about state finances, climate change.
Yeah. Climate change is a massive financial risk, and it's one that I think is only going to get more significant in the years to come.
In what way?
Well, think about it. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more intense.
Right.
And each disaster comes with a hefty price tag for recovery and rebuilding. And guess who often ends up footing the bill?
State governments.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about hurricanes and wildfires. Think about things like rising sea levels and extreme heat.
Right.
These things might not be as visually striking as a hurricane,
right,
but they can have a huge financial toll.
Yeah, it's not hard to imagine how that would impact state budgets, especially in places like Florida that are particularly vulnerable to hurricanes and heat waves.
Florida is a great example. It's a very popular destination, partly due to its low taxes, but those low taxes come at a cost.
Right.
Especially when you consider the state's vulnerability to climate change and its growing Medicaid costs.
It's like a dangerous combination.
It is, and it's a situation that a lot of states are facing, even if they're not quite as exposed as Florida is.
Yeah.
We're essentially sleepwalking into a financial crisis if we don't start taking these risks seriously.
So it feels like this perfect storm brewing, with climate change, pension liabilities, all these other factors. Are states doing anything to prepare for these challenges?
Yeah, there's some states that are taking proactive steps, which I think is encouraging.
Okay, like what?
Well, one tool that's being used is something called a stress test, which is similar to what banks went through after the Great Recession.
So they're trying to figure out how well their finances would hold up under different scenarios.
Exactly. It helps them identify weaknesses and potential breaking points,
Right.
so they can take steps to mitigate those risks. At least 20 states are already using this approach,
Okay, good.
which I think is a very positive sign.
Are there any other proactive measures that they're taking?
Yeah. Another key tool is what's known as a rainy day fund.
Okay.
These are essentially savings accounts that states can tap into during economic downturns, including those caused by, unexpected disasters.
So it's like an emergency fund for the state.
Exactly. Having a healthy reserve of cash can really help states weather these storms.
Yeah, makes sense.
The level of preparedness varies widely, though. Some states like Wyoming and Alaska have very robust rainy day funds.
They could weather a pretty long storm.
They could finance their operations for months if they needed to.
Wow.
But others like New Jersey, Montana, and unfortunately Illinois, again, have dangerously low savings.
So they're more vulnerable to any kind of shock.
Exactly. And when you combine that with the growing threat of climate change, it creates a very precarious situation.
Okay, so we've got some states that are prepared, some that aren't. What about the states that rely heavily on energy production for their revenue? How are they handling this evolving financial landscape?
Yeah, that's another really critical piece of this puzzle. States like Alaska, North Dakota, and Wyoming have long benefited from their rich energy resources,
Right.
particularly oil. They collect a lot of revenue through what are called severance taxes,
Right.
which are basically taxes imposed on the extraction of natural resources.
So their economies are really dependent on the oil and gas industry.
Exactly. And for a long time, that's been a good thing. But as the world transitions away from fossil fuels, that dependence is becoming a liability.
Right.
It's another example of that double-edged sword that we've been talking about.
So they're facing a potential fiscal cliff as the demand for oil declines.
That's the risk, and it highlights the need for these states to start diversifying their economies and investing in new industries,
Right.
particularly renewable energy. It's a big task,
Yeah.
but it's essential for their long-term survival.
It's like they need to reinvent themselves. I can't imagine that that's an easy thing to do.
It's not, but the good news is that some of these states are already making progress. Even Wyoming,
Okay.
which is, kind of a state that's synonymous with coal production, is starting to explore wind and solar power.
Oh, wow.
They're recognizing that the future is in renewables, and they're taking steps to be a part of that future.
That's encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
So is there a light at the end of this tunnel? It seems like states are facing an onslaught of challenges here.
It's not all doom and gloom. I think there are reasons to be optimistic. One is that more and more states are acknowledging the problem and taking steps to address it.
Yeah.
We're seeing greater transparency, more
Wow.
proactive planning, and a willingness to embrace, difficult but necessary reforms.
So maybe learning from some of the mistakes that have been made.
It seems so. And another reason for optimism is that despite all these challenges,
Right.
states across the board have maintained strong credit ratings.
Uh-huh.
That means that investors still have confidence in their ability to manage their finances.
That's a positive sign.
It is.
So it seems like the takeaway here is that while the challenges are very real, there's also a growing awareness and willingness to actually address them.
Exactly. And I think that's the first step toward a more sustainable and resilient financial future for states.
Well, that's all the time we have for part 1 of this deep dive. Join us for part 2, where we'll continue exploring the challenges and potential solutions facing state finances in the U.S.
Looking forward to it. We were talking about climate change and its impact on state finances before the break.
Right.
And, one startling statistic that I think really drives this home
Yeah.
is that nearly every single county in the United States
Wow.
is exposed to at least one type of climate hazard.
Every single one. I knew it was bad, but I didn't realize it was that widespread.
Yeah, it's easy to focus on, the big dramatic disasters like hurricanes and wildfires.
Right.
But even the less obvious climate impacts can have a huge financial toll.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, think about extreme heat.
Okay.
It's not as visually striking as a hurricane,
Right.
but it can devastate agriculture. Crops wither, livestock suffer, and those impacts ripple through the entire food system.
So those rising temperatures could translate into higher food prices for everyone.
Exactly. And, certain regions are particularly vulnerable. The Midwest, for example.
Right, come breadbasket.
A region that's known for its agricultural output, extreme heat there could impact the entire nation's food supply and contribute to inflation.
Yeah, it's amazing how these things connect. We often think about the environmental impact of climate change, but the economic consequences are just as real and far-reaching.
And here's another wrinkle. The financial markets haven't fully grasped the magnitude of these climate risks.
Okay.
So, for example, municipal bonds, which are often used to fund infrastructure projects,
Right.
don't adequately account for these risks.
Hold on, back up for a second. What are municipal bonds and why does this matter?
So municipal bonds are essentially loans that individuals or institutions make to state and local governments. And these governments use that money to fund things like roads and bridges and schools.
Oh,
And investors buy these bonds expecting a return on their investment.
right. Makes sense. So you're saying these bonds don't factor in the potential costs of climate change.
Right. So imagine a coastal city issues bonds to build a new waterfront park. The bond doesn't account for the risk of rising sea levels that could flood that park in a few years.
Right.
Investors might buy those bonds without fully understanding the risk, and the city could end up facing these massive unforeseen costs down the line.
It's like building a house on a floodplain and then acting surprised when it floods.
Exactly. And this lack of awareness is a major concern. Some experts are calling for more transparency and better risk assessment in the municipal bond market. We need to make sure that these climate risks are clearly reflected in bond pricing.
Sounds like we're setting ourselves up for a potential financial crisis if we don't address this soon.
I think the risks are very real, but the good news is that there's growing awareness of this issue, and some states are taking steps to mitigate these risks.
Which brings us back to something we talked about earlier, proactive planning. What are some specific things that states are doing to prepare for these financial challenges, whether it's climate change or other factors?
Well, we talked about stress tests, which
Right.
are a good way to identify potential weaknesses. Another really crucial measure is building up those rainy day funds that we talked about.
Those state-level emergency funds.
Exactly. Having a healthy reserve of cash can really help states weather economic storms, including those caused by natural disasters or other unexpected events.
Right, so it's like having a financial cushion for when things go wrong.
Exactly. Unfortunately, though, not all states are taking this as seriously as they should.
Right. I guess that makes sense. I mean, some people are good at saving money and some people aren't.
Yeah, it's a similar concept with states. It often comes down to political will and, making tough decisions about spending and revenue. States that prioritize saving are in a much better position to handle these unexpected challenges.
So it's not just about cutting costs, it's about investing wisely for the future.
Exactly. And that brings us back to those energy-producing states that we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Alaska, North Dakota, Wyoming. They've benefited greatly from oil and gas revenue.
Right.
But that revenue stream is likely to decline as the world moves away from fossil fuels.
Right, they're facing that potential fiscal cliff. What can they do to prepare for a future beyond oil and gas?
They need to diversify their economies. That means investing in new industries, particularly renewable energy, and retraining their workforce for jobs in those sectors.
Okay.
It's a big task, but it's essential for their long-term survival.
It's almost like they need to reinvent themselves, which I imagine is a really difficult thing to do.
It is, but the good news is that some of these states are already making progress. Even Wyoming, a state that's synonymous with coal production, is starting to embrace wind and solar power.
Wow. So even the most traditional energy-producing states are starting to see the writing on the wall.
It seems so. They're recognizing that the future is in renewables, and they're taking steps to be a part of that future.
That's good. That gives me some hope. It seems like there's a growing recognition, even in unexpected places, that we need to kind of change course here.
There is, and I think that's a really important development. Facing these financial challenges is going to require bold thinking and a willingness to embrace new solutions.
So are we headed for a fiscal cliff, or is there light at the end of the tunnel? What's your overall assessment of the situation?
I I think it's a mixed bag. The challenges are real, and some states are in a much more precarious position than others.
Right.
But, I'm encouraged by the growing awareness of these issues and the willingness to take action.
So it's not a hopeless situation?
Not at all. I think there's a path forward, but it requires smart decision-making, long-term thinking, and a bit of that, American ingenuity that we're known for.
I like the sound of that. We need a dose of optimism these days.
We do, and I think there's reason to be hopeful. I think we're starting to see the beginnings of a real shift in how we approach these challenges.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this episode.
We have.
I've talked about pensions, tax cuts, climate change, energy transitions, and the importance of proactive planning.
It's been a lot.
It's been a fascinating, albeit somewhat sobering conversation.
It has. But I think these conversations are important the more we understand the challenges.
Right.
The better equipped we are to find solutions.
I completely agree. Well, listeners, that's it for part 2 of our deep dive into the world of state finances. Join us for part 3, where we'll continue to explore these complex issues and discuss some potential paths forward. See you soon. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been taking a look at the world of state finances, and it's a complicated picture. Lots of challenges.
Yeah.
But before we get too gloomy, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some potential solutions, maybe some reasons for optimism.
Yeah, I think that's important. It's easy to get caught up in all the problems.
Right.
But it's crucial to remember that there are things we can do to address these challenges.
Wow.
And one promising trend that I'm seeing is a growing recognition that this is a long-term game.
Okay.
States are starting to move away from just reacting to crises,
Right.
and they're starting to embrace more proactive planning.
So it's about anticipating those challenges and having a plan in place rather than just putting out fires as they pop up.
Exactly. And it's not just about preparing for economic downturns. It's about thinking about the long-term impacts of things like climate change, demographic shifts, technological advancements.
Right.
All these factors are going to play a role in shaping state finances in the coming decades.
So it's almost like they need a crystal ball to see into the future.
Maybe not a crystal ball, but, sophisticated modeling tools can help them project future costs and revenues with a reasonable degree of accuracy.
Okay.
And that allows them to make more informed decisions today. It's about using data to anticipate potential challenges and opportunities.
So data-driven decision-making is becoming more important than ever.
Absolutely. And it's not just about crunching numbers. It's about considering a range of potential scenarios from best case to worst case and developing contingency plans for each one.
Right.
It's about being prepared for whatever the future might hold.
Yeah, that sounds like a really smart approach. But I imagine it also requires a lot of coordination and collaboration.
You're right. States can't do this alone. They need to work together, share best practices, learn from each other's successes and failures. We need to see more cooperation, not competition between states.
Right, so breaking down those silos and fostering a more collaborative environment.
Exactly. And it's not just about states working together. It's about building partnerships between state and local governments, as well as with the private sector and nonprofit organizations. It's going to take a collective effort to navigate these complex challenges.
Okay, so we've got proactive planning, data-driven decision-making, collaboration. Are there any other key ingredients in this recipe for financial stability?
Yeah, I think one area that often gets overlooked is the importance of public engagement.
Okay.
We need to involve citizens in the budget process, make financial information more transparent and accessible, and really foster a dialogue about the trade-offs and choices that need to be made.
So empowering citizens to really understand and contribute to the decisions that affect their lives.
Exactly. When people are informed and engaged, they're more likely to support responsible fiscal policies, even if those policies involve difficult choices. It's about building trust and shared responsibility.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems like open communication and collaboration are essential for finding those sustainable solutions.
They are, and ultimately that's what this is all about, creating a more sustainable and equitable financial future for all citizens. It's a challenging task, but it's not an impossible one.
You mentioned earlier the role of the federal government. How does that fit into all this?
The federal government plays a really significant role in state finances. Both through direct funding
Right.
and policies that impact state economies. Think about things like disaster relief infrastructure investments, support for the transition to a clean energy economy.
So it sounds like states need a strong partner at the federal level to help them navigate all of these challenges.
Absolutely, but it requires a commitment from federal policymakers to really prioritize these issues and work collaboratively with states. It's a two-way street. States need to communicate their needs effectively, and the federal government needs to be responsive and supportive.
So it's a delicate balancing act.
It is. It requires clear communication, a willingness to compromise, and a shared understanding of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into state finances. We've explored the challenges, but we've also highlighted some potential solutions and reasons for optimism. Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Sounds good. What is it?
We've talked about the challenges facing states now, but what about the future?
Right.
How are states going to cope with things like climate change, the needs of an aging population down the road?
Yeah.
What role can we as citizens play in shaping those outcomes?
Yeah.
These are really important questions that I think we all need to consider.
Yeah, I think you hit on a really important point here. Awareness is the first step. The more we understand about the complexities of state finances, the better equipped we are to engage in meaningful conversations and advocate for responsible policies. We all have a stake in creating a more resilient, prosperous future for our communities and for our nation as a whole.
That's a great message to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into state finances. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
It was my pleasure.
And remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. We encourage you to continue exploring these issues and engage with your local and state leaders to help shape a brighter financial future for everyone.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, keep learning and keep asking questions.